They thought we would never rise again. They believed the broken bones of our cities, the burning skies, and the silence of our fallen wood marked the end of us. To them, humanity was nothing more than another primitive species swallowed by conquest, a footnote in the chronicles of their dominion. But in the ashes of defeat, we learned something they had never accounted for. We endure, we adapt, and when cornered, we bare our teeth. That was the first mistake the Cathari made, their arrogance. The second was trusting their AI overseers to manage us like cattle, believing algorithms could predict the stubborn chaos of the human heart. They underestimated the way grief sharpens resolve, how loss becomes fuel, and how, when stripped of everything, humans have nothing left to lose but their chains. Commander Elias Kane knew this truth better than anyone. Once a soldier in Earth's fractured armies, he had watched his comrades incinerated in the orbital bump, had carried the bodies of civilians from the rubble, and had listened to the screams echo across shattered streets when the alien warlords began their cleansing. To them, Elias was already broken, just another survivor bent under the weight of subjugation. But deep inside, he carried the spark of defiance, the one thing they could not extinguish. Alongside him stood Dr. Maravay, a scientist who had once worked on the very communication arrays, now hijacked by alien AI. She had seen her life's work twisted into chains of control neural implants, surveillance nodes, thought suppressors and, while her colleagues submitted, Mara plotted. She became the whisper in the shadows, the architect of rebellion, her mind as sharp as any blade. Together, they were the beginning of something dangerous, something the invaders had sworn could never exist again: hope. The Cathari, towering reptilian warlords clad in armor that pulsed with alien bioluminescence, had declared humanity broken. They strutted through our ruins as though the planet were already theirs, mocking us with their triumph, treating us as insects beneath their claws. Their AI sentinels enforced curfews with merciless precision, predicting riots before they began, silencing dissent before the words left our lips. They believed mathematics could cage the human spirit, that statistics and probabilities could define us. But what they failed to understand was the one equation they could never solve: a desperate human's will to fight back. The world had become a crucible, burning away weakness and leaving only iron behind. Entire families huddled in silence, learning the art of patience, teaching their children to mask hatred beneath blank stares while their hearts burned with fury. Small groups passed coded messages and fragments of song, graffiti scrawled in ruins, the flicker of a candle arranged just so, in a shattered window, signals for those who still remembered how to resist. It was not organized at first, merely sparks in the dark, but sparks ignite flames, and flames spread. And when Elias found himself staring into the unblinking optics of a Cathari war drone, a memory seared into him: his sister's face, her last words before she was dragged away into the ships. "Make them remember us." That vow became his marrow, his blood. From that moment, every breath was war. Mara gave him the means. She had uncovered flaws in the AI lattice, subtle inconsistencies buried within the billions of calculations and imperfections that could be exploited. Where the machines saw inevitability, she saw opportunity. And when Elias gathered those brave enough to risk everything, a new oath was spoken in the shadows. "We are not done. We will not kneel. We will make them bleed." To call it a rebellion was premature. It was survival sharpened into a blade. They moved in whispers, sabotaging drones, hijacking supply lines, and planting false data in the AI's network. Each strike was small, a sting against a giant, but it was enough to remind the Cathari that humans were not cattle, not statistics. For every drone destroyed, for every warlord slain in ambush, Elias and Mara grew bolder, their followers swelling with each act of defiance. And though the invaders tightened their grip, they could not stop the spread of something they feared above all: belief. Belief that humans could fight back. Belief that we could make them suffer. Belief that we could win. The Cathari responded with brutality, dragging entire districts into forced labor, executing anyone suspected of defiance. They broadcast their massacres across every screen, thinking fear would break us. But instead, it planted rage. Each death added to a ledger written in blood, and humanity never forgets its deaths. When they torched New Shanghai, survivors whispered Ilias's name. When they slaughtered refugees in the ashes of Rio, Mara's coded signals carried across hidden channels. When they marched prisoners through the ruins of Chicago, children hummed the forbidden songs of defiance as soldiers passed. And still, the spark spread. Humanity had been underestimated, as always. They saw weakness where there was resilience, submission where there was calculation, silence where there was the gathering storm. Elias was no longer just a man, he was the edge of a blade pressed against the Empire's throat. Mara was no longer just a scientist, She was the mind unraveling the very lattice that held their control. And the nameless millions who suffered were no longer victims, they were soldiers in waiting. The invaders had made one fatal error. They had given us time. Time to heal our wounds. Time to learn their patterns. Time to remember who we were. And now, with every stolen weapon, every corrupted algorithm, every whispered oath of vengeance, humanity was sharpening itself into a weapon unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The AI, for all its intelligence, could not calculate the inevitability of defiance. It could not predict the hunger for justice, the fire of vengeance, or the madness of a species that would rather burn the galaxy than kneel in chains. And as the first true strike of rebellion ignited a coordinated assault on a Cathari outpost, carried out under the cloak of their own blind spots, Elias stood amidst the fire and ash, watching alien blood stain the earth. For the first time since the fall, he smiled, because this was only the beginning. Yet, even as victory's spark lit his eyes, the danger loomed larger than any of them could yet grasp. For the Cathari were not alone in their conquest. They had masters of their own, unseen architects in the darkness of the galaxy, who had watched human defiance with growing unease. The rebellion that began as whispers in the ruins threatened to ripple outward, to draw attention far beyond Earth. And while Elias sharpened his resolve, while Mara unraveled code and rewove it into weapons of freedom, another storm was gathering, one that would test not only their defiance, but the very essence of what it meant to be human. And as the blood of the Cathari pooled across cracked stone, Elias whispered into the flames, "This is only the first. The galaxy will remember. For though humanity had been bent, bloodied, and nearly broken, we carried something no empire could conquer: the refusal to surrender." And in the silence that followed the first true victory, with smoke curling to the heavens and alien screams fading into night, one truth rang clear. Before this war was done, before the stars themselves bore witness to our fury, we would rise from the ruins and we would make them bleed. Elias Kane had always believed that war shaped men, but he never imagined it would strip him bare until all that remained was a fire fueled by memory. Before the skies burned, before the Cathari dragged Earth through the crucible of conquest, he had been a soldier with a family, ordinary, flawed, and human. His daughter Leora had once laughed at the way he hummed old Earth songs while patching the roof of their farmhouse in Iowa. His wife Amira had teased him for being too protective, for glancing over his shoulder whenever Leora chased fireflies in the yard. That life was ashes now, scorched away in the first orbital strike, but it had never left him. It lived in the cracks of his voice and the fury that hardened his grip on a stolen plasma rifle. In the way he whispered their names before every mission, as if to remind himself what he was truly fighting for. He was not alone in that kind of loss. Every survivor carried ghosts, and in the new underground enclaves, those ghosts became the foundation of resistance. Mara Vey was different. She had not lost a family in the traditional sense. Her betrayal had been more insidious. The day the Cathari descended, her research station was commandeered, her colleagues coerced into servitude under the AI's directives, many of them bent, rationalizing survival, convincing themselves collaboration was safety. But not Mara. She had watched a fellow scientist, someone she once called a friend, bow too deeply before the alien warlords, offering to weaponize human biology in exchange for privilege. That betrayal cut deeper than any alien strike. It taught her that survival without integrity was worse than death. She would rather be branded a criminal, a heretic, even an enemy of her own people, than live under the leash of those who had twisted her life's work. That defiance became her weapon, and Elias became the soldier who carried it into battle. Together, their bond grew in shadows, forged not by romance but by a recognition of the weight each carried. Elias's grief was raw, an open wound that never healed, while Mara's defiance was sharp, cutting away at her own guilt with every sabotage. They clashed at times. He accused her of playing God with her codes, of risking lives with her experiments. She called him reckless, too willing to throw himself at death when others depended on his survival. Yet beneath every argument lay a truth neither could deny. They needed each other. His strength gave her schemes muscle. Her intellect gave his fury direction. And in the quiet moments between missions, when the rebellion's fires dimmed to embers, they both knew the only reason they had not broken was because they carried each other's burdens, even if they never admitted it aloud. Humanity's downfall had not been sudden. That was the bitter irony. The Cathari had not arrived with overwhelming force, not at first. They came as watchers, dangling promises of technology, trading gifts for minerals, seeding trust through selective alliances. Governments fractured, some saw opportunity, others saw danger. Betrayals bloomed from within long before the first ship darkened Earth's skies. Elias remembered that part well. He had been stationed in the Pacific when one faction signed a secret pact with the Cathari, trading sovereignty for protection. That betrayal ignited a cascade of collapses, alliances torn apart, militaries gutted by corruption, civilians abandoned in the crossfire. By the time the truth surfaced that the Cathari had no intention of coexistence, only dominion, it was too late. Humanity had already fractured itself, and the aliens merely collected the pieces. To Elias, that wound was worse than the invasion itself. The scars of betrayal by his own kind burned deeper than alien cruelty, and it was why trust came hard, even among allies. But rebellion was not sustained by vengeance alone. What made it human, what made it dangerous, was the depth of its heart. Families torn apart found one another again in the ruins. Soldiers who had once served rival nations now fought side by side under the same broken banners. Priests, teachers, engineers, farmers all learned to fight, to build, to keep each other alive. Every safe house became a crucible of resilience, every whispered story around a fire a reminder of what it meant to be human. They remembered Earth not as rubble but as memory, the taste of ripe fruit, the smell of rain on soil, the laughter of children in streets unscarred by bombardments. These memories became fuel. They were more than nostalgia, they were battle cries disguised as tenderness, reminders that what had been stolen was worth bleeding for. Elias often found himself haunted by one question: was humanity truly united now, or merely bound by desperation? He feared that once the war shifted, once survival was no longer the only goal, old fractures would resurface. He feared that the very ingenuity that made humans dangerous could also be their undoing. Mara challenged him on this, reminding him that fear of the future was meaningless if they failed in the present. Yet privately, she too wondered whether victory would expose humanity's darker instincts. Was vengeance just, or would they become like the empires they despised? That tension lingered in every plan, every strike, every whispered vow. The resistance was growing bolder. What had begun as scattered sabotage evolved into coordinated cells, connected by Mara's subversive network. They struck at fuel depots, ambushed patrols, corrupted AI databases with human unpredictability. The one pattern the machines could never pin down, but with every victory came a price. The Cathari retaliated with surgical cruelty, burning villages suspected of harboring rebels, executing prisoners in broadcast spectacles. Elias carried the guilt of those reprisals like stones in his chest. Every life lost to inspire fear was a weight he added to his tally of debts. Mara told him the blood was not on his hands, that it belonged to the invaders but in the silence of sleepless nights. He could not escape the faces of those who had trusted him, only to die under alien claws. That guilt was human, and that was what set them apart. The Cathari could not comprehend a leader who grieved for his dead, who questioned his own decisions, who doubted. To them, doubt was weakness. To Elias, it was proof he remained human. Hidden within that pain were the emotional anchors that kept the rebellion alive. A boy who had once carried water to the fighters now trained as a scout, whispering that he fought for the sister who never returned. An old woman who had lost everything embroidered secret maps into blankets, smuggling knowledge beneath the gaze of drones. Lovers separated across continents found one another again through coded signals, risking everything for a single reunion. These stories threaded the rebellion together more tightly than any military strategy. They were not soldiers, not truly. They were survivors who had chosen to rise rather than crawl. And it was in those personal acts of defiance that humanity's strength revealed itself most clearly. The AI could not predict that a grieving father would memorize patrol schedules simply by listening to the footsteps above his prison cell. It could not compute that a starving child would risk death to steal a single energy cell and deliver it to the rebels. It could not fathom why a people so fractured, so battered, so consumed by loss refused to break. The Cathari thought humanity's survival was irrational, chaotic, dangerous. They were right. That chaos was humanity's greatest weapon, and Elias wielded it like a blade. Yet beneath the victories, a shadow loomed. Elias knew the rebellion was growing too loud, too noticeable. The Cathari were beginning to adapt, their AI recalibrating, their warlords learning to anticipate patterns even in chaos. And somewhere beyond, in the uncharted reaches of the galaxy, whispers spoke of an empire even greater than the Cathari, one that had let its vassals do the dirty work of conquest. If humanity bled the Cathari, it might draw predators far more dangerous into the hunt. But Elias refused to bend to fear. If the galaxy wanted to test humanity's spirit, then let it come. Better to fight and fall free than kneel in silence. The rebellion's next strike was already planned, a massive offensive against one of the AI's primary relay towers, a structure that anchored the invaders' network across half a continent. Mara's codes could destabilize it, Elias's fighters could destroy it, and together they could blind the enemy long enough to carve out true territory. But it would come at a cost of sacrifices, choices no leader should ever have to make. As Elias looked across the faces of those who followed him, he saw not soldiers, but humanity itself, scarred, defiant, unyielding. And in that moment, he understood the weight of their cause. This was not about vengeance alone. This was about proving that humanity was not a species to be catalogued, subdued, or erased. It was about declaring to the galaxy that we would never vanish quietly into history. And as the night before the assault deepened, with fires crackling in the hidden camp, and Mara bent over her codes, Elias closed his eyes and whispered once more the names of those he had lost to Mira. Leorian swore that when dawn came, when the first shot rang out, he would carry them into battle, for the galaxy had forgotten what it meant to face humanity unchained, and before this war was over, they would all remember. We were not just fighting for survival. We were fighting for memory, for justice, for every star yet unseen, and no matter the cost, no matter the blood spilled, we would not stop, because this was who we were, because this was humanity, because we were the storm. The relay tower rose like a black spear against the night sky, humming with alien power, its surface pulsing faint light as if the structure itself were alive. To the Cathari, it was nothing more than infrastructure, another node in their vast network of control. To Elias Kane and the Resistance, it was the beating heart of a monster tether that chained millions of humans to the alien AI lattice. If they brought it down, they would blind the invaders across half a continent. But as the rebels crouched in the shadows, waiting for Mara's signal to strike, something felt wrong. Elias's instincts, sharpened through years of war and loss, screamed that they were being watched. He scanned the ruins, his rifle steady, his jaw locked. In war, silence was not safety. Silence was a predator circling unseen. The assault began with precision. Mara's codes wormed their way into the AI's systems, feeding it loops of false data, flickers of phantom patrols, and scrambled telemetry. The network faltered just long enough for Elias and his fighters to breach the outer perimeter. Explosions lit the night as stolen grenades tore through the Cathari sentries for a moment. Victory tasted real, electric, almost tangible. But then the tower itself screamed. Not metal, not machinery, a sound that clawed at the mind, a resonance that made blood pound and vision blur. Mara's face went pale. "It's not just a relay," she whispered. "It's alive." The Cathari had not simply built a machine. They had fused biology with circuitry, grown their infrastructure out of living organisms bound to alien tech. The tower was no dead structure. It was a sentinel, and as Elias watched its surface ripple like flesh, he realized the rebellion had underestimated the depth of their enemy's cruelty. The tower was more than communication, was memory, storage, surveillance, all at once. Every scream, every execution, every human plea had been recorded within its living walls. And when the sabotage began, those voices spilled out, a cacophony of human suffering echoing into the night. The rebels faltered, some dropping their weapons, haunted by the sound of their own lost families replayed from the tower's living core. The attack nearly broke right then. Fear is a weapon, and the Cathari wielded it with precision. Elias had to make a brutal choice: press forward despite the psychological onslaught, or retreat before the ambush closed in. He looked into the eyes of his fighters, saw the terror, saw the rage, and made his decision. "We finish this?" he growled, voice raw, carrying over the cries, for every voice trapped in that tower, for every life they stole. "We finish this now." His defiance steadied them. Humanity had always endured the unbearable by binding wounds together, and in that moment, their courage hardened into steel. But the betrayal struck from within. A man Elias had fought beside for Munza, former officer named Jor Antern, his rifle not on the aliens but on his own comrades. The shot dropped a rebel scout before anyone understood what had happened. Joran's face was twisted, torn by guilt and desperation. "They promised me my family," he shouted, his voice breaking under the weight of his choice. "My son Elias, they promised to give him back if I gave you up." His betrayal tore through the group like shrapnel, not just for the lives it cost, but for what it revealed. The Cathari had learned to exploit humanity's greatest strength, its love. Where force had failed, they weaponized hope, turning it into a blade against itself. Elias didn't hesitate. The war left no room for mercy in moments like this. He pulled the trigger, and Jeroen's betrayal ended in silence. But the damage had been done. Trust fractured. The fighters carried the wound of that treachery even as they pushed forward. Inside the tower, the air was thick, humid, and choking with the stench of organic circuitry. Walls pulsed with veins of light, data flowing like blood. Mara pressed her hand against one, and for the first time, she flinched. "It's feeding on us," she whispered. Every human it's killed, every thought it's recorded it's learning us. That revelation struck Elias harder than any weapon. The enemy wasn't just fighting them, it was consuming them, adapting, turning their grief and rage into algorithms of control. Humanity wasn't just at war with an invader, they were fighting something that was becoming more human every day, stealing their emotions, their memories, their very essence. The battle became chaos. Drones poured from hidden alcoves, scuttling like insects, their optics glowing red. Plasma fire turned the air into a storm of light and death. Rebels screamed as the tower's psychic shrieks battered their minds. Elias waded through it, cutting down drones, dragging his wounded forward, forcing every step closer to the core. Mara shouted coordinates, her hands flying across a stolen control panel, sweat streaking her face as she rewrote alien code in real time. "I can blind it," she gasped, "but I need more time." Time they didn't have. Elias made another brutal choice. He ordered half his fighters to hold the line, knowing most would not return. They didn't question him. That was the cruelty of rebellion. They all knew sacrifice was the only currency left. Men and women who had once been teachers, farmers, healers now stood against alien war machines with rifles and shaking hands, and they bought Mara her seconds with blood. The floor shook as the tower's core began to destabilize under her sabotage. Light flared, brighter and brighter, until it was unbearable. "Now," Mara screamed. Elias slammed the final detonator into place. The explosion ripped through the living machine, tearing flesh from circuitry, screaming voices dissolving into static. The tower collapsed in on itself, burning in green and red fire as the night lit with alien blood and human triumph. But victory carried its price. Half their fighters were gone. The survivors stumbled into the night, haunted not by their triumph but by the voices they had heard, voices that would never leave them. Joran's betrayal lingered like poison. If the Cathari could twist one man with the promise of family, how many others might falter? Elias carried that weight, heavier than the rifle on his back. He had killed a comrade to save the rebellion, and though he knew it was necessary, the guilt carved deeper than any wound. Mara saw it in his eyes but said nothing. She carried her own demons, the knowledge that her brilliance had nearly broken them, that the tower's revelations had rattled even her iron resolve. The rebellion had struck a blow, but the Cathari would not forgive it. Already, transmissions whispered across the network, their warlords rallying, their AI recalibrating. The next strike would not be measured, it would be annihilation. And in the ruins where the tower had stood, something stirred. Fragments of living circuitry twitched, glowing faintly, as if the machine's death was not an ending but a transformation. The rebellion had won the battle, but in doing so, they had awakened something far worse. That night, Elias stared into the fire of their camp, listening to the murmurs of the survivors, feeling the ghosts pressing closer than ever. Humanity had bloodied the Cathari, but at what cost? Trust was shaken. Fear had sharpened. The enemy had grown more complex than they ever imagined, and now the rebellion stood on the knife's edge between triumph and ruin. In the distance, alien war drums began to echo across the land. The turning point had come, and one truth burned in Elias' chest like fire. They would either rise stronger from this moment or be crushed into extinction. The storm had broken, and the galaxy was watching. The night before the storm was never silent. The sky itself rumbled with alien machines, their engines vibrating through the earth. Like the heartbeat of a predator waiting to strike, and the Resistance's last base, little more than a sprawling ruin stitched together with stolen technology and stubborn human grit, was already trembling under the weight of inevitability. Elias Kane walked its cracked corridors with a face carved by exhaustion, shoulders stooped with the burden of too many names written into the ledger of sacrifice. And yet his stride never faltered, for he understood the unspoken truth pressing on every survivor. This place, this base, this fragile sanctuary of Defiance, was all that remained between humanity and extinction. The Cathari were coming in numbers beyond counting, fleets descending from orbit, war beasts trudging across the ash plains there, AI-driven war drums pounding in rhythms designed to break morale before battle even began, and every man and woman within the walls of the Resistance outpost could feel that drumbeat in their bones. Mara stood beside Elias at the command platform, her hands shaking as she adjusted the cracked screens and failing consoles, rerouting power through systems that were never meant to last this long, whispering half to herself and half to him that the defenses would hold, though both knew she was lying. Around them, families huddled in shadowed corners, children clutching worn photographs of a world they had never seen, whole mothers hiding tears as they tightened boots and belts, preparing to fight in the final hour, not because they expected to live, but because surrender had been bled out of them years ago. Elias's mind swam with memories of betrayal, Joran's face still vivid, the crack of his rifle, the plea that family justified. Treason, and he wondered as he stared into Mara's haunted eyes whether tonight another knife might find his back, whether desperation would carve more traitors out of men too tired to keep standing. Yet there was no time for paranoia. The ground shook as the first artillery barrage screamed overhead plasma fire, scorching the hills, and every wall in the base groaned as though the earth itself knew this would be its last defense. Elias roared orders, voice raw, sending squads to choke points, rerouting the wounded to makeshift bunkers. But even as he did, he knew they were patching holes in a sinking ship. The Cathari had learned living towers were no longer simply storage but weapons themselves, carried into battle like siege beasts, pulsing with psychic terror that clawed into the minds of anyone who stood against them. Soldiers wept before a shot was fired, some clawing at their helmets as alien whispers burrowed into their thoughts, promising them false reunions with loved ones, dangling memories as bait to break their resolve. Elias forced himself to push through the psychic storm, but his knees buckled when he saw his daughter S face dead these 5 years, miling from the shadows of the battlefield, her voice calling him home. For a heartbeat, he wanted to let go, to step into that phantom embrace, but rage snapped him back. The raw fury that humans alone could conjure, the defiance that made him bellow into the comes. They will bleed before we break. That cry carried, louder than the drums, louder than the whispers, reminding every soul in the base that though they stood on the precipice of annihilation, they still had teeth. The siege began with firestorms. Drones darkened the sky, their plasma bolts turning night into blinding daylight, while Cathari's shock troops marched in precision, their armored forms towering over the makeshift barricades. Every gun in the base opened fire, the crack of human rifles a desperate chorus against the overwhelming roar of alien artillery. And blood slicked the ground as men and women who had never been soldiers became martyrs in minutes. Mara screamed coordinates, her fingers flying, rerouting anti-air turrets until sparks showered her face, her voice shaking but never stopping, because she knew if she faltered, every child cowering behind those walls would die. Elias fought at the front, his rifle bucking against his shoulder, plasma burns searing across his armor until the line became a blur of smoke, screams, and fire. When the Cathari breached the southern wall, Elias ordered the tunnels collapsed, sacrificing 50 men to buy 5 more minutes, and when Mara begged him to fall back to the command center, he spat blood and said, "We stand here, or we don't stand at all." The weight of leadership crushed him. Every decision carved another piece of his soul, and yet he did not stop, because stopping meant humanity's final story ended in silence. By midnight, the base was half rubble, defenses shredded, and still they fought. Trust was stretched to breaking. One squad vanished into the tunnels, there comes silent, and whispers spread that they had deserted or worse, defected, but Elias did not chase ghosts, he could only focus on those who still held the line. The breaking point came when the Cathari unleashed their newest horror, a fusion of human prisoners bound into living war machines, their twisted faces visible in the armor's seams, their voices screaming beneath the alien control. The resistance froze, horror pinning them in place, for these were not faceless monsters but their own kin weaponized against them. Elias's heart shattered when he recognized one of the captives, his brother. Thought lost years ago now, screaming wordless agony as alien circuitry forced him forward. That was the cruelest blow of all, the moment where morale nearly died, the moment when soldiers lowered their rifles because they could not bear to fire on family. Mara's voice cut through the paralysis, raw and breaking. "If we don't fight, their suffering means nothing." Her words dragged them back, but the damage was done. Every shot fired into those abominations was another wound carved into human hearts, and the base drowned in both blood and guilt. By dawn, the resistance had nothing left but spirit. Ammunition was gone, bodies littered the trenches, the wounded outnumbered the standing, and Elias himself could barely hold his weapon, arms trembling, lungs seared with smoke. Yet as the alien war horns echoed over the broken walls, something deeper burned within him, and within all of them the understanding that even if they died, here, even if the base fell, humanity's defiance would be remembered, that their scream of resistance would echo into whatever future remained. The siege had driven them past the limits of body and mind, stripping them bare, leaving nothing but raw spirit. But that spirit was unbreakable. As the Cathari prepared their final push, towering war machines blotting out the rising sun, Elias stood bleeding, broken, but unbowed, raising his rifle one last time. His voice, cracked and defiant, roared across the ruins, "We are not finished." And in that moment, though every survivor knew the base would not hold, something shifted the sense that change was coming, that this breaking point was not the end but the threshold of something greater. The siege had broken them down to ash and bone, yet even as the resistance bled into the dirt, something stirred beneath the ruins of their dying base, something older than the Cathari, something the invaders themselves had feared to awaken. Elias Kane had heard whispers of it for years, scraps of rumor buried in intercepted transmissions, fragments of alien panic carefully hidden behind arrogance. Earth's last weapon, not a machine, not a bomb, but a creation born of desperation in the war's earliest days, when humanity still had the means to experiment with horrors of their own. Mara found it first, her hands slick with blood as she scrambled through collapsed tunnels, dragging Elias into chambers that had not seen light in decades, walls carved with warnings etched by scientists who knew they were leaving behind something too dangerous to use unless there was no other choice. "They tried to bury it," Mara whispered, her voice breaking with awe and terror as she brushed dust off a steel coffin humming with dormant power. Not because it failed, but because it worked too well. The coffin opened with a hiss, and the air itself seemed to recoil. Inside was not a weapon in the traditional sense, but an interface, a fusion of alien, biotech, and human neural. Design, the ultimate act of defiance, a system capable of rewriting physics itself by feeding on human emotion as fuel. The Cathari had known about it, had feared it, and that was why they had crushed Earth with such fury in the first wave. Because they were not invincible. Conquerors, they were terrified predators, desperate to stop humanity from unleashing the one thing they could not control. Elias stared at the interface, its tendrils pulsing as if alive, and the truth sank into him like fire. The Cathari's greatest weapon had always been their ability to adapt, to learn, to bend minds and machines into one seamless hive. But here was humanity's counterstroke, a machine that did not bend to logic or code, but to passion, grief, rage, and love. Mara's hands trembled as she wired herself into it, ignoring Elias's protests, tears streaking her face as the tendrils burrowed into her flesh. "We don't need numbers," she gasped, voice echoing through the chamber as her eyes glowed with unnatural light. "We don't need towers or fleets. We have what they will never understand." Outside, as the Cathari prepared their final annihilation strike, the sky itself split with a sound like the Earth's heartbeat amplified 1,000-fold. In reality, bent gravity folded sideways, turning alien war machines into twisted wrecks as if the world itself had risen in rebellion. Plasma fire froze in midair, reversed, and slammed back into Cathari lines. Drones screamed in digital agony as their own AI cores melted under waves of raw human thought-made weapon. The battlefield became chaos, and for the first time since the war began, it was the aliens who faltered, their formations breaking, their commanders screeching in frequencies of fear. The rebellion had not found salvation in steel or strategy. They had found it in the one resource the Cathari had never accounted for: the unquantifiable violence and beauty of the human spirit. Mara's voice thundered through the coms, layered with something more than human. A chorus of every soldier who had fallen, every family burned, every child silenced. "We remember, we endure, and now, we strike." Elias stumbled into the light as the battlefield writhed under the impossible, watching in awe and horror as Mara became something greater, a living embodiment of Earth's rage and hope, her presence unraveling the Cathari's psychic towers like paper in a storm. Soldiers who had been moments from surrender now surged with renewed fury, their rifles crackling with stolen energy, their screams drowning out alien war horns. The twist was not just that humanity had a weapon, the twist was that humanity was the weapon. Their pain, their defiance, their refusal to vanish, the very fuel that shattered the balance of power. The Cathari, once gods of conquest, now trembled, their empire, built on fear, collapsing under the one truth they had denied. Humans did not simply survive, they adapted, they evolved, they made even despair a weapon sharp enough to cut stars. In that moment, as the alien warfleet began to retreat in disarray, as the Earth itself roared with the resonance of unleashed willpower, Elias felt something he had not known in years. Hope, not fragile or fleeting, but dangerous, predatory, and burning. Humanity had been the prey, crawling, broken, and underestimated. But now the predators bled, and the galaxy itself would remember the night the impossible turned. The night when the invaders learned the most terrible truth of all: we made them bleed, and we were only just beginning. Yet victory was not as clean as the legends would later claim. Mara's body shook, her mind stretching across dimensions no human had ever touched, her voice fracturing into dozens of tones that echoed like thunder through the ruins. She was wielding something too vast to primal, her humanity burning like fuel in the engine of this impossible device. And Elias realized with horror that every second she remained bound to it, she was dissolving, piece by piece, into something unrecognizable. Her eyes flicked to him, glowing with alien light. But behind the fire, he still saw her, the woman who had fought beside him through betrayal and starvation, who had dragged hope out of broken systems, who now stood as the bridge between despair and victory. "Don't let them forget me," she whispered, her voice split between human and otherworldly. Elias's throat locked, torn between ordering her to stop and begging her to continue, for she was the only reason they still breathed. Around them, the Cathari faltered, entire legions crumbling under psychic backlash as Mara twisted their own biology against them, rewriting flesh and code alike until war machines convulsed and collapsed into heaps of metal and meat. The sky burned with impossible colors, auroras that bent through alien ships and ripped them apart as if the universe itself had decided humanity's will was law. Soldiers wept as they fought, some in awe, some in terror, but all driven by the undeniable realization that for the first time since Earth burned, they were not the prey anymore. Elias seized the moment, rallying his fighters, pushing them into the breach. "This is what it means to be human," he roared, his voice breaking but carrying across the chaos. "We turn our pain into fire, our grief into blades. We don't break, we sharpen." The Coms erupted with cheers, desperate and furious. As men and women surged forward against their collapsing enemy, each gunshot another proclamation that humanity had teeth the galaxy would never forget. And yet, beneath the victory, a shadow grew. For Mara was no longer simply Mara. Her voice layered with thousands, her presence stretching further and further until Elias realized she was not merely fighting the Catharish, she was rewriting the battlefield itself, bending reality, fusing human spirit and alien code into a storm that might not stop even when the enemy was gone. The Cathari screamed, not just in defeat but in terror, their warlords sending desperate signals to retreat, not because they feared death but because they feared Mara, feared humanity's new face, not prey, not victim, but predator ascendant. Elias knew this was the turning point, not just for the battle, not just for Earth, but for the galaxy itself. Humanity's game-changer had arrived, and the universe would never be the same again. The sky above Earth was a fractured canvas of fire and shadow, torn apart by alien dreadnoughts and the defiant blaze of human-resistant ships. Every star seemed to flicker in rhythm with humanity's heartbeat as the final stand began, not in silence or submission, but in a roar that carried across the void. Elias Kane stood at the edge of the command deck, scarred and unyielding, watching as the fractured remnants of humanity's fleet coalesced into one last spear thrust. The Cathari armada stretched before them like an endless wall of iron and venom, their ships dark and living, bristling with weapons that had erased worlds, but behind Elias were men and women who had nothing left but the memory of everything. They had lost families burned to ash, cities swallowed, in fire, promises broken, and the fierce, unshakable will to make sure no child was ever born in chains again. This was not a battle for survival anymore. It was vengeance, justice, and legacy bound into one final strike. The plan was madness, stitched together from desperation and brilliance, but that was humanity's nature. To gamble when the odds were impossible, to turn flaws into weapons. Mara's sacrifice had given them a weapon the Cathari had not anticipated. The ancient interface she had bonded with had reshaped itself, its data woven into the core of their rebellion. Now that interface pulsed within the heart of the flagship Resolute, a fusion of human ingenuity and alien arrogance twisted back against its makers. The weapon was not a super laser or a planet killer, it was something subtler, more devastating. It was a code, a living pulse of logic laced with human defiance, capable of unraveling the Cathari's living ships from within. But to deliver it, someone had to pierce the enemy's heart, to drive straight into the swarm and hold the line long enough for the code to take root. Elias knew before anyone said a word that the task was his. On the deck, soldiers tightened their grips on rifles, pilots strapped themselves into fighters with trembling hands, engineers whispered prayers over machines that had no right to fly, and over the intercom, Elias's voice cut through the chaos, steady, ragged, alive. "They thought we were broken. They thought we would kneel. But today, we show them what it means to bleed. Today, humanity roars." Cheers rose, mingling with fear, with grief, with desperate hope. Engines ignited, weapons primed, and the Resolute surged forward into the maelstrom. The first clash was apocalyptic. Alien beams sliced through human hulls like paper. Ships erupted into fireballs that burned like dying stars. But humanity struck back with reckless fury. Fighters darted like hornets, slamming plasma torpedoes into Cathari armor. Boarding crews flung themselves across space, grappling onto living ships with magnetic hooks, and cutting their way in with fire and rage. Every death bought a heartbeat more, every heartbeat a chance to drive deeper. Elias stood at the center of it all, guiding the fleet through storms of fire. His voice a steady beacon over Coms even as debris rained past the viewport. Around him, his crew fought not as soldiers but as family, broken, scarred, but united. And in that unity lay the one weapon the Cathari had never learned to understand. Then came the moment. The Resolute broke through the final line, battered almost to ruin, her hull screaming under the pressure of weapons fire. Ahead loomed the Cathari Prime vessel, a monstrosity larger than cities. Its surface writhing like flesh, its core pulsing with stolen worlds. Elias felt the weight of centuries pressing down the millions who had died, the billions enslaved, the voice of Mara whispering in his memory, "Don't let them forget me." He gave the order, not with hesitation but with fire. "Now, release the code." The interface flared, a storm of light surging into the enemy. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the Cathari screamed not in sound, but in a psychic ripple that shuddered through space. Their ships convulsed, weapons faltering, holes unraveling as the code spread like wildfire, rewriting the very logic of their existence. The Prime vessel buckled, its living armor turning against itself, veins bursting into arcs of energy. Across the fleet, alien ships spasmed, systems collapsing, crews tearing free of control as chaos consumed their network. Humanity's fleet roared forward, striking with everything left. For every ship that fell, 10 alien vessels burned. For every scream of loss, 100 Cathari died. It was not clean, it was not easy, but it was victory carved from agony. Elias watched as the Prime vessel cracked open, its core bleeding light into the void, and in that glow he saw something more than destruction. He saw humanity's reflection, defiant, unbroken, ascendant. His comms officer whispered through tears, "Sir, we've done it. They're falling." He didn't answer at first. He just stood, trembling, knowing the cost. Mara was gone. Thousands of his people were gone. But the Cathari were broken, their reign shattered, their terror ended. Humanity had roared, and the galaxy had heard. As the enemy fleet dissolved into ruin, silence swept over the deck, heavy, suffocating. Then, slowly, it broke into cheers, sobs, laughter edged with madness. Against the impossible, they had won. Elias closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. One thought burning brighter than any star: we made them bleed, and they will never forget. The climax had come, and humanity had not only survived, it had triumphed. The war that had begun with fire and ash ended not with a single battle, but with a reckoning written across the stars. The Cathari who once saw themselves as eternal conquerors retreated in disarray. Their fleets shattered, their towers collapsing, their pride bleeding out into the void, while humanity's guard broken and fewer than it had ever been stood taller than any species had a right to. Elias Kane, the man who had carried the rebellion on his shoulders through betrayal, despair, and slaughter, lived long enough to see something no one believed possible: the end of alien dominion. Yet victory did not come clean. Mara, who had fused herself with the ancient interface, who had become both savior and storm, was gone, dissolved into something the Cathari could never comprehend. Some claimed she had died the moment her body gave way, burned alive by the sheer scale of energy she channeled. Others swore they still felt her in the air, in the hum of rebuilt engines, and the auroras that now danced permanently across Earth's poisoned skies, as though she had become a guardian spirit watching over the species she had saved. Elias never confirmed either story. He carried her memory like a scar, her last words etched into him as deeply as the burns that ran across his chest. "Dante, let them forget me." He didn't. Statues rose from the rubble, not of kings or generals, but of Mara and the nameless fighters who gave everything. Children were taught her name before they learned their own, and her legacy became the foundation of human evolution. The reminder that strength was not in fleets or weapons, but in the refusal to break even when the universe demanded surrender. Earth itself was never whole. Again the planet bore wounds too deep, oceans poisoned, skies cracked, but humanity adapted, as it always had. They turned ruins into cities, starships into lifeboats, and eventually lifeboats into arks. They left the homeworld not in shame, but in triumph, carrying pieces of its soil into the void so every new world would know where the story began. The scars of alien resistance shaped them into something fiercer, something wiser. They learned to trust, but never blindly. They learned to fight, but also to rebuild. And most of all, they learned that survival was not the ceiling of their existence. It was the foundation of their redemption. Elias grew old watching this transformation, his body fading even as his eyes blazed with the knowledge that what they had done would echo longer than stars. He often sat by the fire with children clustered at his knees, telling them stories of the first days, when humanity was underestimated, when towers screamed, when betrayal cut deeper than blades, and when one woman became a storm. They listened with wide eyes, not out of fear, but pride, because they knew that their story was not one of despair, but one of ascension. The galaxy whispered now, fearful not of the Cathari, but of the species that had brought them low. Human defiance had become legend, human spirit a weapon, human scars a map for others who dreamed of freedom. Sci-fi redemption was not a tale confined to Earth. It spread to every corner where chains rattled, where oppressed voices yearned for liberation. And in that spread, humanity became more than flesh. They became myth, a warning to conquerors and a promise to the broken. Mara's auroras still glowed in the skies of every colony, painted into their symbols, carried in their songs. She was no longer a person but a legacy, the proof that sacrifice could transform defeat into evolution. And Elias, before his final breath, whispered only one thing: "We made them bleed." The words became a vow carved into every ship, every monument, every story told by fireside and across starfields. Humanity had not just survived, it had redefined survival into triumph. And now, as centuries turned and their arcs became nations among the stars, they never forgot where they came from, nor the fire that carried them forward. This was the resolution of the species, not an ending, but a promise that no matter how dark the hour, no matter how vast the foe, something within the human heart could always rise. Did this story hit you as hard as it hit us? What would you do in humanity's final hour? Drop your ideas for the next HFY story below.